Larry, it's somehow amazing looking at the Trump administration starting with the teasing Greenland, Canada, Mexico, and coming right now to the southern part, to Brazil and Venezuela. Did you see that the United States offers a 15 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Venezuela's defense minister?
Yep,
And his name is
50 million for Maduro.
what is that? This is the the defense minister of a country. What kind of information are you seeking for? You got
Well, I hesitate to go this far, but I won't at all. I think when you go insane, then you can look for, and that's really an adjective that describes Washington today, domestically and foreign. When you do that, all bets are off for anything. And one of the things you do is you expand your stupidities, you expand your insanity. You don't curb it, you don't rein it in, you expand it. It excites you when you do that. And that in particular, look at Hegseth and what he's doing with women in the military and what he's doing with Christian nationalism. This is unparalleled. You know, I spent roughly maybe 10 years of my life of a 31-year military career and 40 years in government. I spent maybe 10 up close and personal with the Pentagon in one way or another. I've never seen anything like this. Prayer meetings in the Pentagon, prayer meetings that if you do not come to, you get punished. You actually get punished. Prayer meetings all over the military people talking about things like the end times and the rapture and other ecumenical and what do you call these things now? We call them fundamentalists, but they're dispensationalists, I guess. It's the Great Awakening, whatever. And we've got all these nuts running around, putting Robert E. Lee's statue back up, putting his painting or statue or whatever it is at West Point back in, putting the Isaiah painting back in the Merchant Marine Academy, doing all the things that they're doing, and bringing I don't know if you've been following this, but bringing this pastor who thinks that women are only good for having babies, that women should have never gotten the right to vote, and certainly shouldn't be serving in uniform in the United States military. This is Pete Hegseth's pastor, and this is the kind of stuff that he's promulgating at these prayer meetings in the Pentagon. He's even introducing this pastor to these meetings. Did you ever think you'd hear anybody in the early part of the 21st century, hell, we're a quarter of the way through it now, talking about taking the vote away from women? That's almost prehistoric. I mean, in the sense of all the effort and energy that went in to do that and the rectitude that went into doing that. How do you think the women in the military feel now in the U.S.? Give you three guesses, and the first two don't count. We're making a mess, Nima. We're making a mess everywhere we can, domestically, internationally. We're making a mess. And people keep saying, oh, wait for Trump. Wait for Trump. He's the great peacemaker. You know, well, guilty as charged. I kept desperately hoping, particularly with the Alaska summit, I kept desperately hoping that this man would find something somewhere and strike go. He's as bad as any of them himself. He propagates this nonsense, this stupidity, this insanity. And what a time to be doing that when we need a leader who is really, really mature, knows what he's doing or she's doing, is good at that, and understands this change of power structure in the world and moves to accommodate it and deal with it rather than to fight it and die. Because that's what fighting it means. It means dying. But horribly, it means lots of other people in the world who don't need to die, dying too because of your wrath. And that's what we're becoming. We're becoming the world's ogre.
I don't know if you saw this map, Larry. It shows the pipeline going from Russia to China, the power of Siberia, and the second line is coming, going to Mongolia and then to China. It's they look at Europe. Look at what Europe did to itself during the war in Ukraine. Look at what they're doing right now as we talk. What's happening in the SCO summit?
But it's revivable. The pipeline structure is revivable. Nima, several years ago, I guess probably 30 years ago now, 25, something like that, I went to New York with Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we went to what was billed as one of ExxonMobil's, or I suppose it was probably a consortium of oil companies, command center. And I remember one aspect of the briefing vividly. A gentleman who was fairly competent briefer, but had the details at his beck and call about pipelines and such. He pointed at one particular map that was like the one you just showed, except it was a global map with 4 sections. And what he said, in accordance with that map, he said, what you're looking at, gentlemen, is pipelines pumping and their capacities, pipelines under construction and their cost. And of course, you're looking at where they are. Pipelines projected and their projected cost. And you're looking at the future of world warfare. He just ended it up that way. And, I'm sitting there thinking, I just come from Pacific Command where I was basically a strategist. He's absolutely right. You're looking at all the energy sinews on the globe. You're looking at the veins and the arteries of the world's economies. And there they are. And there they're going to be. And that's their cost. And that's who's going to benefit. And that's who's not going to benefit. And a lot of this is, of course, the pipelines run across these lands that get transshipment fees. So it's a good deal for the countries that the pipelines traverse also. And that was up there in the data stream. All of that's shifted a bit now, and it will shift again in the future and again as more finds are made and as we maybe go more and more to renewables. And that's a worrisome thing about this too, is that we're still doing this and we're still doing it just Katie bar the door, we're still discovering, we're still pumping, and we're still building pipelines. But that's a picture of the future. And you know where most of those lines are now, Nima? They're over there in that place where all the power's going. Or they're coming out of there and going into us to give us our lifeline, particularly Europe.
Larry, in your opinion, how does, if you were to assume the feeling of Donald Trump right now in the aftermath of the summit, do you think they really care about what's going on?
Nima, I think you're giving him credit that I would not any longer give him. I don't think he has the capacity to grasp what's going on. Nor do I think there are any real talented cabinet officers around him or sub-cabinet officers. Sometimes they're smarter than the cabinet officers, deputy secretaries of state, for example, and such, to tell him. I just don't think he's assembled a great crew for this kind of moment in world history. And he's certainly not a great president for this moment in world history, unless, of course, divine providence is looking down on us and saying, I spite thee, America. You've been very, very bad, and I'm going to give you the worst possible leaders you could have, and weather it, because the storm is coming.
Here is what Poon and Modi told each other during the summit, Larry.
We have developed cooperation at various levels. Trade and economic cooperation overall shows positive momentum.
Развивается туристический обмен.
Tourist exchanges are developing.
Мы тесно координируем наши усилия на
We closely coordinate our efforts on the international stage.
Excellency, हमारे special and privileged strategic
Mr. President, this demonstrates just how profound and comprehensive our specially privileged strategic partnership truly is.
हमेशा
Even under the most challenging circumstances, India and Russia have always moved forward shoulder to shoulder.
देशों के लोगों के लिए
Our close cooperation matters not only for the peoples of our two nations, but also for ensuring global peace, stability, and prosperity.
I've been a diplomat long enough, short enough, to understand that you don't want to read too much into that kind of language. But in the circumstances which I just inartfully and poorly described to you about this shift of power, I think the world needs to heed those words, whether they are for propaganda purposes, and by that I simply mean they're trying to get back at us in order to maybe eliminate some of the tariffs or whatever, immediate tactical reasons for doing this. And there's probably some of that to it. But I think what we're watching is a sea change in the world's way of doing business. We're watching the first waves lap ashore. We're watching the first recognition by some fairly talented leaders that they are inheriting the mantle of global leadership. And we're watching them talk about it.
What was so amazing that they didn't talk about Ukraine. We haven't heard anything about Ukraine. I think it was done intentionally. They deliberately decided not to talk about Ukraine. I don't know if Russia was asking for it or somehow China didn't like to be mentioned, Ukraine to be mentioned. What's your feeling on that?
No, if they could, and if Putin were amenable to doing it, I'm sure, and he had the money and the time, I'm sure he would build a wall 60 meters high and all across the front lines and say to the other side of the wall, Germany, Poland, France, England, all the NATO countries, go to hell and fester in your own poison. Me and my Indian and Russian friends on the other side, and my Indian and Chinese friends on the other side, if this were Putin speaking, we're going to have a pretty good world, and we're going to enjoy it. And by the way, we are 4/5 of the world. They can't do that. They can't do that, and they know that. So they've also got to be talking behind the scenes probably now about how they're going to handle this mess that we've created and continue to create and will continue to create until the sudden body blow comes that hopefully convinces us that it's worthless to dispute this. It makes no sense. I'm not talking about surrendering. I'm not talking about choo-hoing, holding your hands up in the air and saying, I give up, run over me with a tank or whatever. What I'm talking about is dealing with the world as if it were human. And that all the people in the world, and especially those with the premier power, have a right to deal in the way that they wish to deal. And if you have some problem with that, you settle the problem by other than mechanically military means. You talk, you work, you use diplomacy, you solve problems together. I'm convinced, and I've had a lot of exposure to China, not so much exposure to Russia, but lots of exposure to China. And China is the number one power in the world, Nima. Today, China is the number one power in the world. They don't want this kind of conflict and this kind of friction. They understand they're human enough to know that there's some of that in the world. You got to deal with it, but you deal with it with diplomacy. You deal with it by talking, and you deal with it by talking in a way that supports your surplus of power as opposed to the deficit of power of the other side. But you recognize that deficit of power because you don't want to hamstring everything that you're talking about. And that's what we're doing all the time now. So it's a different kind of world. We haven't dealt in this. We were really good in the beginning in dealing with this kind of world, because we were pipsqueaks. We were pipsqueaks. We had the French, we had the Spanish, we had the British, of all people. We had the Russians. We had people surrounding us. They were on the Mississippi. They were in the Northwest. They were in Canada. They were in Mexico. They were everywhere. We had diplomats, and diplomats had to deal with real power surrounding them. Now we've become, or we became, the real power after World War II. And instead of developing the kind of tools that would be necessary to deal with the world when that power somewhat attenuated and others' power grew, which was inevitable. Look at your history books, Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi looks too much at his history book, but it's the Old Testament. The Old Testament, to hell with the Old Testament. It's not a guide for life. Sorry, Bibi, it isn't. You have to come into the world with an appreciation now, United States of America and Europe behind it. You have to come into the world with an appreciation of power is shifting, and you have to deal with it. And that doesn't mean that you go to the back of the line. It doesn't mean that you get second fiddle or third or fourth fiddle. It means that you have to use your brains and your talents at diplomacy to affect the kinds of relationships in the world that, interestingly enough, the other side wants. Russia, India, and China, yeah, they can be bastards. Everybody can be. But if you sit down and talk and you work things out, you're a lot better off, especially if you're going to hurl nuclear weapons at one another. You're a lot better off than if you build up the nuclear or the military problems that cause you to go nuclear. And that's what we can't seem to get through our heads. I shouldn't find it all that difficult to believe, because this is what history reads. You know, this is what Mearsheimer talks about all the time, and John is absolutely right. Whether you're talking about rising power, sinking power, and the inevitability of war between them or whatever, the power dynamics of the world, I don't buy all of John's realism theory, because sometimes it takes you straight to hell. But I do buy the fact that you have to deal with reality more or less 90% of the time, or you're going to wind up in a real pig in a poke. And that's what we're doing right now. We're being idiots. We're being insane. We're being stupid, and we're led by increasingly stupid people. In all three branches of government, we have stupid people.